Hello and welcome to this next module where we're going to be covering the risk theme. Now, the risk theme, as you well know, is that theme within Prince2 that contains all of the activities and the actions spread across the 7 processes that help the project management team deal with and manage uncertainty in the project. Now, we have built this course taking your foundation level knowledge into account. So we're assuming that you've either at the very least completed the foundation level training and ideally have sat and passed the foundation level exam. If you did the foundation level training some time ago, then I would suggest as far as possible that you rewatch the foundation level module if you still have access to the material. Obviously, if you did it quite recently, then you should really be up to speed and you can simply continue along. Now, if you don't still have access to that foundation level material, then at the very least, I would review chapter 10 in the Prince2 manual alongside the Prince2 foundation level syllabus and ensure that all of the stated foundation learning objectives, that you've got them and sort of are comfortable with them and understand them. Now, this is a theme chapter or a theme module, and so by now you know that we're going to spend some time recapping some of the key concepts, and then we'll explore the management products that relate to the risk theme before looking at those roles and responsibilities that relate again to the risk theme. So all of the roles in the Prince2 project and everything that everyone has to do to some extent that relates to risk. So that's our agenda for the balance of the module. So without further ado, let's jump straight into it and have a look at some of these key concepts. Risk is an uncertain event or set of events that, should it occur, will have an effect on the achievement of objectives. A risk is measured by a combination of the probability of a perceived threat or opportunity occurring and the magnitude of its impact on objectives. Now, remember as well that we have a tendency when we talk about risk to always assume that risks will lead to negative outcomes. And of course, uncertainty could lead to a negative outcome. But of course, we know that some uncertainties may also lead, certainly from a project perspective, to a positive outcome on one or more of the project objectives. So those uncertain events that could have a negative impact on objectives, you'll recall we call risk threats. And those which can have a positive or favorable impact on the project objectives, we call risk opportunities. Now, we establish in the Prince2 project, and we'll have defined as part of our risk management approach, we will have defined a risk management procedure. This is a set of rules, if you like, a set of actions that kick in that govern the iterative management of risks as they are identified. And this is called the risk management procedure. Let's take a quick look at that. Have a look here at the standard Prince2 risk management procedure. You'll see it's an iterative type of procedure. In other words, it's cyclical. It doesn't sort of happen once, it's ongoing. Each and every time that a risk is identified, this cycle of identify, assess, plan, implement, and ultimately on a base of communication will be happening over and over and over again, once for each time a risk is identified. And it's constant and iterative and ongoing in the background. You know, one of the really nice things about the risk theme is that it permeates through each and every process, and it's constantly happening, and there's an element of risk management associated with almost every activity in the method. But let's have a look at this process, or this procedure rather, in a little more detail. So we start off with the identify step. Now you'll see that identify is broken down into 2 parts. We've got identify context and identify risks. So when we say identify context, what we mean is we must identify the specific project objectives which are at risk and formulate a suitable approach, a suitable risk management approach that will protect those vulnerable objectives. So what we mean here is we have to consider the project circumstances. We have to look at the project that we're dealing with and say, well, which of our project objectives are more at risk than any others? If, for example, my project is to deliver a new toy for the Christmas market, well, one of the project objectives which is most at risk in that set of circumstances is my time frame. If I can't deliver this project in February. I'll have missed the Christmas market altogether. And so any risk which affects the project timescales, that delays the project, will then necessarily be a much more important risk for me to deal with. Now, if my project costs a little bit more than I thought it was going to cost, then that's fine. That's a risk. Obviously, we don't ideally want the project to cost more, but if it does cost more, that's something that we're expecting may or may not happen. But it's not the end of the world. What would be more catastrophic, though, for my project is if the project is delayed beyond the Christmas market, in which case the entire rationale for the project itself may sort of evaporate. Now, in terms of identifying these objectives that are at risk, what we then need to do, as I said, is formulate a risk management approach. And what we're effectively doing here is tailoring this approach so that any risks which affect those specified objectives effectively are heavier than risks which affect other objectives. So in the case of a Christmas toy, any risk which affects timescale is deemed to be a heavier risk than a risk which affects my budget. Now, the scale for weighing individual risks, what makes something weigh a particular or to have a particular weight, is defined within that risk management approach. So identify context, understand what is at risk, and create a risk management approach that is capable of protecting those vulnerable objectives. The second step, or the second part of the identify step, if you like, is to identify the risks themselves. Now, this is constant and ongoing. That identify context step we know is happening when we create the risk management approach. So that's happening once at the beginning of the project, in the initiating a project process, when we create the risk management approach. Of course, if we need to update the risk management approach, we'll do that throughout the life of the project. But we would ideally want that risk management approach to be robust enough to be able to last for the life of the project, if you like. Of course, if we found that risk management was weak, then we'll upgrade our risk management activities to compensate. But we would assume that it would be good enough from the outset. But identifying risks themselves is constant and ongoing throughout the entire project. Now, you will find that risk identification, there tend to be what I call sort of risk identification hotspots during the life of a project. In other words, if you plotted the timeline of a project and you put a dot along that line to show every point in time at which a risk was identified, there tend to be these little hotspots where you find more risks being identified than at any other times. And that's typically when we are planning, because the moment you plan to do something, the natural questions to be asking is, well, what can go wrong? What can get in our way? Is there anything we can do to improve? Is there an opportunity which might be able to be seized at this point in time? So typically when you're planning, but of course at any point, risks might be identified. And remember that a risk might be raised by the project manager, a risk might be raised by the project team manager, or by the project board, or from an external stakeholder. Regardless of where the risks are identified from, they will ultimately find their way into the risk register. And part of putting them into the risk register, it will be the next step in this procedure, which is to determine how heavy this risk is. In other words, what's its probability, what's its impact, and therefore how does it affect the total weight on my scale. Now, there are lots of different techniques available for helping to identify risks. And you could start by, in a large scale complex project, I would certainly recommend that a risk specialist is employed to help with risk management, because it's really one of the most fundamental aspects of project management. But simple things like reviewing lessons, using risk checklists, prompt lists, simple brainstorming exercises with the team, as well as things like risk breakdown structures, are things that can be used that can help us to identify risks, because sometimes you don't know that a risk is there. Remember, we can only identify risks that we can think about. And sometimes it helps to consult with third parties, review lessons, look at other projects, and use these prompts and breakdown structures that will help us to identify risks. One of the other things that is important to do or can be done is to formulate what we call early warning indicators. Now, an early warning indicator is a set of circumstances that should that predetermined set of circumstances exist or be reached, that would trigger some type of risk intervention. So that might be something like more than 5% or more than 5 issues are taking longer than 1 week to resolve within any 3-week period. If that set of circumstances were to exist, that would be indicative of a risk to the project timeframe. And so that set of circumstances having been achieved would trigger some risk intervention or some intervention to ensure that the project time scales are more closely monitored. Now, those early warning indicators will be defined in the project's risk management approach. We also need to express any risks that we do identify unambiguously. Now, this is a bit of a human factor. As humans, we are typically quite bad at articulating risks, and we tend to get confused between whether we're talking about what we call the risk cause, or are we meaning the risk event or the risk effect. And so Prince 2 has created this cause, event, effect structure so that we are able to articulate risks unambiguously, so that it is clear whether I'm talking about the uncertainty, what's going to happen if the uncertainty becomes a certainty, in other words, if it occurs, and then how that affects my project, because those things are very different. Let's use an example, or we'll continue our example of putting in a water pipeline, for example. And let's imagine that there's this potential for some industrial action. There might be a strike, and if that strike occurs, then the labor might not be on site for a couple of weeks, which means that the project will ultimately be delayed and will cost more money and might go over budget and so on. So we talk about the risk cause being the source of the risk, the area of the uncertainty. The risk event is what's going to occur if that uncertainty manifests itself, becomes a certainty, and the effect, what is the effect on the project? So the risk cause in this set of circumstances is this potential for the industrial action, this potential for a strike. The risk event would be, the laborers actually go on strike, and as a result, work on our site, work on the water pipeline comes to a halt. And the risk effect is that there will be a 3-week delay to the project. And so now it is clear whether I'm talking about the uncertainty being the strike, or the event is the strike occurs and we don't dig any more ditches, or the effect being the delay to my project. So remember that. Risk cause, risk event, risk effect. Always articulate risks like that, makes it clear and unambiguous to everyone we're communicating with. So that's the identify step. 2 parts. Identify context, identify risks. Identify contexts, create the risk management approach. Identify risks, create the risk register, populate the risk register, and articulate risks clearly using the cause, event, and effect structure. The next step in the risk management procedure is to assess, and you'll see as well here that the assess step is broken down into 2 parts: assess estimate and assess evaluate. Now we'll look at those 2 independently, but in simple terms, assess estimate means to give the risk, the identified risk, a particular value, and assess evaluate means to add those values up. In other words, put it in the risk register, have a look at the new total. What's the new total weight on the scale as a result of adding this this new risk into the risk register? So assess estimate. What it means is estimate this risk, weigh this risk in terms of probability and impact. Now, probability and impact are the 2 primary means by which we weigh risks, by which we assess risks and estimate their value or their size. But there's a secondary consideration to make, and that is something that we call proximity. Now, proximity is the time distance, if you like. How far into the future is this risk likely to occur if it occurs at all? In other words, is this a risk that's likely to be imminent? In other words, it's going to happen tomorrow or the day after? Or if it occurs, is it something that will only occur in a week's time or 2 weeks' time or a month's time, or potentially even beyond the stage or beyond even the project? So we assess probability in terms of how likely is the risk to occur, the measure of likelihood. We assess impact. What is the effect on the project in terms of a specific objective if the risk is to occur? And what is its proximity? Is it going to happen tomorrow, the next day, 2 weeks' time, or a month into the future? That's how we estimate the size of that risk. Okay, now there's a number of techniques for assessing probability and impact. One of them is a probability impact grid. You can use an expected value technique, which is normally done in monetary terms, or display these risks visually using something called a summary risk profile. Let's have a look at an example of this, one of which we'll look at is the probability impact grid. So what you have here is a probability impact grid. Okay, it defines the scales on the vertical for probability, on the horizontal axis here for impact, and it's given them categories, sort of narrative categories, if you like, of very low, low, medium, high, very high impact, and probability as well. And for each of those assigned narrative value, there's a numerical, a decimal value that's applied. So you can see here, if you took a low probability risk, which has a value of a decimal value of 0.3, and it has a high impact. So we're looking at a low probability, high impact risk. Well, the high impact decimal value is 0.4. That means that this risk, 0.3 multiplied by 0.4, has a decimal value, has a numerical value of 0.12. So we'll call that 0.12 units of risk, and that can be pounds, or however you want to equate those 0.12 units. But essentially what they are a numerical value that now gives that risk a weight, and that is the numerical value that will sit in the risk register, and that means that there are 0.12 units of weight on our scale, and so my risk tolerance now becomes a number. So I'm allowed to have 7 units of risk on the scale based on the project's cost and benefit ratios. So this the assess evaluate step, where we add up the values, we could effectively be adding up the values from the probability impact grid. So if we use this type of grid to assess the risks, then the individual decimal values that each identified risk carries are ultimately totaled together, and that gives me that net risk exposure, which we know risk exposure is the extent of risk borne by the project organization at a point in time, the net or the total weight on the scale. So that's my second step there, if you like. Other techniques such as the expected value, very straightforward. I mean, you're multiplying the probability by the expected value. Now, if it's a monetary value, you could say, well, this risk has a 20% chance of happening. If it happens, it's going to cost the project £10,000, and therefore that risk weighs £2,000. Now that's not money, that's a way of comparing risk A to risk B. So then your risk tolerance would have to be a monetary value. So you would have to say, okay, for this project, no more than 10% of the project budget should ever be stored, if you like, or carried in terms of an expected value for the identified risk. So it's up to the project, it's up to the practitioners, if you like, to determine how risks will be quantified, how they'll be evaluated, and against what scale. Now, when you create this probability impact grid, of course, you have to make sure that the scales are relevant to the project time frame, for example, and the project budget. So you can't say that in every project, a risk which causes a 1-month delay is high impact, because this could be a very long project. Equally, if this is a 2-month project, even a 1-week delay could be high impact. So it's important to ensure that the scales against the probability impact grid are relevant to the project timescales and budget, at least, so that they become relevant. So that's a degree of tailoring that has to be considered, and this probability impact grid will find its way into the risk management approach, and it will be the baseline against which every risk that is identified gets assessed, so that we can enter it into the risk register. Now, one of the benefits of this is that it helps you compare risks with each other. You know, how would you compare a high probability medium impact risk to budget with a low probability high impact risk to quality, with a medium impact medium probability risk to timescales, for example? It's very difficult to determine which of those risks is more important. And by setting the scales, and of course, if for example, you've determined that your project timescales are the objective most at risk, then you up those numerics so that those risks weigh more. Okay, so it's a very good way of doing things, and gives you quite a lot of granular control over the assessment of those risks. So that's the second step. Okay, assess, estimate, give each risk a value, however you choose to do it, whether it's a probability impact grid or an expected value technique, and then assess, evaluate, where you effectively add the values up and determine the net exposure. What's my new total exposure as a result of the inclusion of this newly identified risk? The third step in the risk management procedure now is the step we call plan. And during the plan step here, we're effectively going to be determining suitable responses for the risks which have been identified. Obviously, we would have to have considered the effect of the risk first and foremost on the project, on the business case, and on corporate program management or the customer. And having understood what the effect of the risk is on these factors, then identify a suitable response to that risk. Now, there are a number of different responses which we can take. And the type of response that we can take typically depends on whether that perceived uncertainty, whether that risk is perceived first and foremost as a threat or an opportunity. Now, if it is perceived as a risk threat, one of the potential responses would be to try and avoid the risk. And by avoiding a risk, what we mean is take action so that the risk can no longer happen. In other words, that uncertainty is eliminated. Or take action to ensure that even if it occurs, it cannot affect us. Either way, we must be 100% certain that by taking this action, the risk is gone, that it can't affect us. So, if, for example, there's a risk of a loss of power, well, we'll hire a generator so that in the event of the power going off, we still have full access to a power source on our building site so that there's no delays. That's an avoid response. It's gone. It's taken. With 100% certainty, we will not be without power. We can take a reduce response. Now, a reduced response is where we eliminate 99% or less, or 99.999% or less of the risk. In other words, we take action that sort of eliminates the chance of it happening, but there's still a residual risk in it. Maybe there's a very small chance of it still occurring, but we can get rid of most of the risk by taking a reduce action. Now, when you reduce, you can either try and reduce the probability of it occurring, or you can try and reduce the impact if it does occur. Either way, it is a proactive risk response. You identify a risk and you take the action regardless of whether the risk is to occur or not. So if the risk doesn't occur, well, you still took the action, and so whilst you might perceive that as a bit of a waste, it would have obviously paid dividends if the risk had occurred. The third type of response is a transfer response, where you effectively transfer some risk threat to someone else. I mean, insurance is the obvious type of risk response that comes to mind here. When you transfer a risk response, bear in mind that you can typically only transfer the financial impact of a risk occurring. So, for example, I've got my building site, building my water pipeline, or whatever the case may be, and I've decided that I need insurance to cover the risk of building materials or tools, for example, being stolen from the building site overnight. And so I have an insurance policy in place. I've transferred the financial impact of that risk. Now, imagine that the tools do get stolen overnight. Well, my insurance company will pick up the cost of replacing the tools. But that process of claiming through the insurance company, of getting the tools replaced and so on, will take time. And that may, let's say it takes a week or 10 days. That may cause now a week or a 10-day delay to my project. Now, if there were liquidated damages, sort of clauses in place, penalties essentially for late completion of the project, I may even be able to insure myself against the penalties for late completion. But what no one can ever give me back is the 10 days of time it takes to get all of the tools replaced. So with a transfer response, remember, you can typically only transfer financial impact. No one can give you back the lost time. But if there's a financial impact of the lost time, you can normally even insure against that. Other risk threat responses include things like sharing, where you would share the risk with the customer and the supplier, potentially might share any identified risk. So perhaps if exchange rates move one way, the supplier would lose a bit of their profit and the customer would pay a little bit more. But that type of response can also be taken for an opportunity. If the exchange rate were to move the other way, then the supplier would make a little bit more money and the customer pays a little bit less. Potentially a threat response where we simply accept that the threat exists. So there's a threat that one of our competitor companies might launch a competing product. Well, there's not a lot we can do about that. We've identified the risk exists, and we may simply just choose to accept that it occurs. We don't do nothing. We still identify the risk. We still weigh it. We still assess its probability. We still assess its impact. We still put it in the risk register. We still log it, and we still monitor it. But we don't have any other active plan in place to deal with it. With regards to a more reactive type of risk response, we talk about preparing contingency plans. This is a sort of plan B, where we identify what actions we are going to take if the risk occurs, but we don't physically take them until such time as the risk actually occurs. So this is more of a reactive risk response, and because it's a reactive response, we are not trying to affect the probability of the risk occurring, but rather we are only limiting or trying to reduce the impact on the project if the risk occurs or when the risk occurs. So think of it as damage limitation to some extent. So if there's a loss of power, then we will go and hire a generator. Now, the commercial advantage of taking or putting a contingency plan in place rather than taking action to go and hire the generator anyway, is that if the power supply is not interrupted, then we've saved ourselves the money that it would have cost to hire the generator. So one has to really consider the probability of the risk occurring and select the most appropriate response. So those are typical risk responses for the threats. So we'll revise them very quickly. We spoke about avoiding a risk, that's 100% getting rid of it. Reducing the risk threat, that's 99% or less getting rid of the probability or the impact. We spoke about transferring the risk, that's insuring yourself or transferring the financial impact of the risk to a third party. We could share the risk, in other words, split it between the customer and the supplier. We could simply accept that it exists and do nothing more than log and monitor it. Or ultimately, we could put a contingency plan in place, a plan B. Now, on the opportunity side of things, we have sort of polar opposites. So the opposite of avoid is exploit. So there's an opportunity, we choose to exploit it. In other words, we take action that means with 100% certainty, if we take this action, then we will gain to a particular extent. We have an enhance response. So this is when you can't guarantee if you take an action that you may benefit, but you would enhance or improve the chances of the project benefiting should a particular response be taken for an identified opportunity. And then the last two for opportunities are shared with the threats. In other words, they are transfer. You could transfer an opportunity, although there's a very, very rare set of circumstances. And share, again, is the same as the risk threat share, where you choose to share. This is when the exchange rate moved in our favor. So we've identified the risk, we've assessed it, we've weighed it, we've put it in the risk register, we understand what impact it will have on our project. We've now formulated some ideas as to what we can do about them, and we've considered the effect that this risk is going to have on the project, on the business case, and on our customer corporate program management, for example. We've identified now a suitable response. We've decided either we're going to take out an insurance policy or take some other action to mitigate this risk and try and minimize any effect it might have on the project. The next step ultimately will be to take this action. But before we look at the implement step of the risk management procedure, understand that any of these risk responses, if there's a cost associated with taking any of these responses, then the cost of the taking this risk response comes from a separate sum of money called the risk budget. Now, Prince2 sets aside, and again, it's not a mandatory budget, you don't have to have one, but if you do have a risk budget, it forms part of the total project budget. So it's not additional money over and above our project budget, it's within that total project budget. But it's money set aside, it's earmarked specifically for responding to risks. So for example, if we decided now to take out this insurance policy, the cost of that insurance policy that we are only buying as a result of an identified risk will come from the project's risk budget. And that is a sum of money included in the project budget, but set aside to fund those specific risk management responses to threats or, in fact, opportunities. Now, that risk budget could be defined as a percentage of project budget. You could use an expected monetary value technique to determine the total risk budget required. But the risk management approach will define how the risk budget is to be accessed. There's a tendency to believe that this risk budget is just available and anyone can spend from it. But the risk management approach will define any specific mechanisms that would need to be followed in order to gain access to that fund set aside for paying for risk management activities. Now, just to be clear again, the general cost of risk management, so if the project manager is spending an hour a day carrying out risk management activities, we're not attributing 1 hour of the project manager's salary to the risk budget. That is a standard project cost. Only the cost of the physical insurance policy or the cost of hiring that generator, those physical responses to specific identified risks, those costs are what come from the risk budget, not general risk management. That is an expected cost, and so it comes from the project budget that's built into the expected cost of the project. So that's taken us now, if we have a quick look again at our risk management procedure, that takes us around from we've identified, we've assessed, we've now come up with a plan. The next step is to implement the chosen response. In terms of implementing the chosen response, Prince2 assigns 2 new roles to this action. That is the role of the risk owner and the role of the risk actionee. The risk owner should be someone who is capable of managing and monitoring the risk and is ultimately responsible for controlling it and keeping track of it. This is because risks are not static, so the weight of a risk is not static. So for example, I think earlier on we used an example of a strike. Well, if there's a threat of a strike, in 6 weeks' time, right now, the probability of that might only be 10 or 15%. But in time, as we get closer to the proposed strike date, and it seems that the trade unions and the resources and the labor unions and so on seem not to have met any common ground with the employers and so on and so forth. Now it looks like the strike might be more more probable. And so it might have gone from 15% to 30% or 60%. And then there's a glimmer of hope normally. There's light at the end of the tunnel. It looks like now we might have come to some type of arrangement. And then the result is that the probability of the risk reduces maybe to 30 or 40%. And then just before the strike date, no, it turns out we can't find any common ground, and now there's a 90% chance of the risk occurring. So as the probability of that risk changes, so the weight of the risk changes. This risk is getting heavier and lighter as probability changes, because remember that the weight of the risk is a function of probability and impact. So as the percentage chance of the risk occurring increases, so the weight of the risk increases. Well, this risk owner is the person who's responsible for making sure that the assessment of the risk, its assessment, its probability and impact assessment, as stated in the risk register, accurately reflects the situation at the current point in time. So we can't just put a risk in the risk register and say, okay, well, it's got a 10% chance of happening. And once it's in the risk register, then there it lives and we never look at it again. We have to constantly say, has it still got a 10% chance of happening? Has it increased to 90%? Because that will affect our total risk exposure. And that needs to be communicated to the project board, ultimately to ensure that the project remains within the risk tolerance. We will also assign a risk actionee. Now, the risk actionee is the person responsible for carrying out the specified risk response, if we choose to take one. So if we've taken a contingency type response, then the risk actionee will be waiting for an instruction to do what we've asked them to do, or to do what we've planned to do should the risk occur. So, simple terms, the risk owner monitors and manages the risk, watches it, and the risk actionee takes the action on instruction from the risk owner. Now, they can in fact be the same person. So one person could be the risk owner and the risk actionee. But the project manager must be cautious about assigning too many risks to a single risk owner. We don't want one person to be bogged down with 20 or 30 different risks to be monitoring, because they'll soon lose control of them. So the project manager should, if assigning risks to specific resources, not assign too many to a single person. And very importantly, we never assign multiple risk owners to a single risk, because if we have a single risk and we say to 3 or 4 or 5 different people, okay, you guys all monitor the risk, well, exactly nobody normally is monitoring it, because everybody thinks that the other 4 are doing it. So the risk owner is another one-person role. It's carried out by one risk, one person, but the risk owner could also be the risk actionee. So this implements step where we take action, assign a risk owner and a risk actionee. This is the step that ensures that the planned risk responses are in fact actioned, and that the effectiveness of the response is then monitored, so that corrective action can be taken if the effectiveness is not in line with the expectations. Now, you'll see that this risk management procedure is all built on a base of communication. Now, Prince2 calls this the 5th step. I tend to think of it more as a sort of base upon which the procedure is based, because the communicate step is happening not as a 5th add-on step, but rather in parallel and in tandem with the other 4 steps. So we identify, communicate, assess, communicate, plan and communicate, implement and communicate. So how do we communicate about risks then in a Prince2 project? Well, it's simple. We use our standard progress controls. We've got our checkpoint reports, highlight reports, end stage reports, end project reports, even exception reports. Now, within the content of each of these reports is a heading where we are able to discuss issues and risks affecting the work package or the stage or the project at that particular point in time. We don't have in Prince2 a particular risk report, but the risk reporting, if you like, the communication of these risk-related information is built into the existing progress controls. Now, importantly here, none of these controls should be mechanisms for raising or escalating a risk in the first place. Remember that particularly those that are time-driven, a checkpoint report might not be due until the end of the week. And if there's a risk identified on Monday, well, why would we wait until the Friday to create the report? So if we do need to raise a risk, we do so using whatever has been agreed in the work package if you're a team manager, or in the risk management approach, and the communication management approach if you are at the project level or higher. We don't use these progress controls, but within the content of these progress controls, of course, we speak about the existing set of risks being dealt with, and the same applies for issues as well. And effective risk management will depend on effective communication and participation in this risk management procedure. Okay, so that was a look at the key concepts relating to risk that are required at the practitioner level. Let's now have a look at the management products that relate to the risk theme. And we'll start, importantly, with the risk management approach. Now, you'll recall from the process modules that the risk management approach is created by the project manager during the initiating a project process. And of course, it can be updated during the course of the project if required. There's no mandatory updating of the risk management approach. But remember, as part of our end stage report, the effectiveness of the project's approaches and controls is always assessed. And of course, if an approach is found to be lacking, then we can always update the approach to be more in line with the requirements of the project at that particular time. So there's no defined place in which it's updated, but of course it can be updated really at any point if required, but created during the initiating a project process by the project manager. Now, the purpose, if you like, of the risk management approach is to describe how risks will be managed on the project. It will include the processes, procedures, techniques, standards, and the responsibilities for risk management within it. So remember that all of our approach documents, I like to think of them as the how documents. So the risk management approach explains how we need to deal with risks on this project. Let's take a look at the composition of the risk management approach. Now, you'll find this in your textbook in Appendix A, and it's entry A24. So we're looking under the composition heading. This tells us all about the parts of the document, if you like. So the risk management approach will contain an introduction. This states the purpose, the objectives and scope, identifies who is responsible for the approach. The risk management process or procedure is then defined, and that will effectively define the procedure we've literally just covered. So that will describe how risks are identified, assessed, how risk responses are planned and implemented, and of course, how risk management activities are communicated. Then we'll define any tools and techniques. So any risk management systems, tools, and so on that need to be used, as well as any preference for any particular techniques which might be used for each step in the risk management procedure. Records speaks of the composition and format of the risk register and any other risk records that are to be used during the project. This reporting heading describes any risk management reports that get produced, including the purpose of the reports, when they are created, their timing, and ultimately who their intended audience is, the recipients. The timing of risk management activities states when formal risk management activities are to be undertaken, for example, at the end of management stages or whatever is specified. The roles and responsibilities will, of course, define the roles and responsibilities for risk management activities. Now, this is where it gets interesting. Scales. So in the risk management approach, we must define the scales for estimating probability and impact. So you'll recall we've spoken about the probability impact grids previously. You would have covered that certainly in foundation level training. And of course, those are the sorts of scales that will be defined. So we need to know when we look at a risk, what makes a risk high probability or low probability. We can't just estimate on a risk by risk basis. There must be some scale, some definitive definition of exactly what does low probability mean. And what does high impact mean, for example? There needs to be a clear guidance given. Now, obviously, the guidance here will need to reflect the probability or at least the time scale of the project. So if it's a very long project, then a low impact risk might be a 1 month delay. If it's a very short project, then a high impact risk might cause a 1 week delay. So you need to ensure that these scales are relative to the time and cost cost of the project, for example. Proximity is guidance on how proximity for risk events is to be assessed. And again, remember that proximity determines, or is a definition of, when a risk will occur. How far away from us in time terms will the risk occur? Now, these can be categorized. In other words, they can be imminent within the management stage, within the project, beyond the project. And again, if you're going to use a word like imminent, you need to define what imminent means. Imminent means within 2 weeks, within 1 month, within 24 hours. And again, that can be defined, if you like, either here or in the scale section if necessary, but it can be defined here. Risk categories defines the risk categories to be used. These are typically derived from a risk breakdown structure, a prompt list of some description. The risk response categories defines the risk response categories that are going to be used, which themselves, of course, depend on whether the risk is a threat or an opportunity. So again, we looked in that risk management procedure at the risk responses, so avoid, transfer, and so on. Those are the categories of the risk responses. Early warning indicators. These are any indicators that are used to track critical aspects of the project, so that if predefined levels are reached, corrective action can be triggered. Typical early warning indicators might be things such as if a particular number of issues are not resolved within a 7-day period, or if the number of risks registered in any 24-hour period exceeds 5, then particular or predetermined early warning actions or actions based on those early warning indications can be triggered. Risk tolerance defines the threshold levels of risk exposure, which, when they're exceeded, will require the risk to be escalated to the next level of management. And remember, our risk tolerance typically expressed at project level, but there may be risk tolerances expressed at stage level or work package level, but they would not be found here in the risk management approach. Those you would find in the stage plan or the work package. So risk tolerance here in the risk management approach is the project level risk tolerance. And then finally, we've got a risk budget. So this will describe whether or not we have a risk budget, and if so, how it will be used. Now, importantly, the risk budget section here in the risk management approach does not define the actual amount of money that's in the risk budget. It simply defines whether there is one or not, and if so, how it will be used. Now, the next management product that we're going to consider is the risk register. You will recall from the initiating a project process that it is created by the project manager during the initiating a project process. It's actually created at the same point in time at which the risk management approach is created, and certainly covered by the same activity, if you like, within the process. And it's that point in time, the very point in time when the risk register is first created, that any risks that would have been recorded up until that point in the daily log are transferred into the risk register, since they now have somewhere to go. So it's created by the project manager during the initiating a project process. And of course, in terms of it being updated, it can be updated really quite flexibly in terms of responsibilities. Typically, the project manager will have access to update the risk register. Typically, project support may even be maintaining it on behalf of the project manager. And there certainly will be projects where team managers may even, particularly if they're internal team managers, have access to the risk register and be able to populate it with risks that affect their own particular work package. So it's updated constantly, certainly updated it during the controlling a stage process, during the managing a stage boundary process, and during managing product delivery, and quite flexible in terms of who does it. So remember that the risk register, essentially the purpose of the risk register, is that it provides a record of all of the identified risks, including their existing or current status and historical information and their history. It's used to obviously capture and maintain all information related to those identified threats and opportunities. Let's now have a look at the composition of the risk register. So we go back to Appendix A, and you'll be looking at entry A25. So again, underneath the composition heading, we're looking at these little bullet points. Each bullet point represents, if you like, a heading in the risk register. You can think of your risk register as a spreadsheet, and each of these is a column. And then each entry in the spreadsheet is a horizontal entry, and will record all of this information about each risk. So we've got obviously the risk identifier. That's now a unique reference for every risk that's entered into the risk register, and typically numeric or alphanumeric value. The risk author is the person who raises the risk. The date registered, pretty self-explanatory. The risk category, now this is the type of risk in terms of the project's chosen categories. These could be risks that affect schedule, quality, legal, for example. Risk description is a description of the risk in terms of the cause, event, and effect. Remember, cause is the source of the risk. The event is what occurs if it comes to light, if it manifests itself, and the effect is what is the effect on my project as a result of the event. Probability, impact, and expected value. This is where we'll define, obviously, the probability and impact. But it's helpful, of course, to estimate what we call inherent values. These are pre-response actions, and residual values, post-response actions. So if our mitigating action reduces the risk, then the residual risk is that little bit that's left behind. Proximity, of course, this will be how close to the current time the event is anticipated to happen. Now, remember that in the risk management approach, we had a scale for assessing proximity. So proximity needs to be assessed against the scale in the risk management approach. Risk response categories, how the project will treat the risk in terms of the project's chosen category. So, for example, threats, we need to avoid, reduce, transfer, share, accept, or prepare contingent plans. And for opportunities, we would like to exploit, enhance, transfer, share, accept, or prepare contingent plans. Then we'll have a risk response. Again, actions taken to resolve this risk, the risk status, typically in terms of whether the risk is still live or dead, and the risk owner and the risk actionee. Remember, the owner, the person responsible for managing the risk, and the actionee is the person responsible for implementing the risk response. So those are the two management products that relate to risk, the risk management approach and the risk register. Now, there's a fundamental difference between the approach and the register. Remember that the approach describes how we're going to do it, and the register is the place where we physically keep track of what we said we were going to do. So it's the place that we carry out the management actions defined in the approach. So that's that for the products then. Let's consider now the various roles that make up the Prince2 project management team and their individual responsibilities with regards to effecting risk management or providing some degree of risk management throughout the life of the project. You'll need to have a look now in your manual at table 10.1. And you'll see here these fairly straightforward tables. You'll be quite familiar with them now. You've got the role on the left and the requirements running down the right-hand side. So this is quite a short one, so we'll have a look at most of them. The responsibility, if you like, from corporate program management or the customer's perspective is obviously to provide the organizational risk management process guide or any other similar documentation, because in those process guides, any project management strategy that applies, or any particular approach that needs to be applied at project level, will of course be defined, and we'll need to ensure that we adhere to those corporate policies and standards and so on. The executive will ensure that risk management approach is appropriate, in other words, that it's tailored appropriately, that it provides an appropriate amount of governance for the project. In terms of risk management, ensure that risks associated with the business case are identified, assessed, and controlled, so protecting their own element here, and escalate risks to corporate program management or the customer as necessary. Those risks that exceed project level risk tolerance will need to go ultimately up to corporate for their input. Senior user obviously will ensure that risks to the users are identified, assessed, and controlled, in particular paying attention to any types of risks that may have an effect on the benefits. The senior supplier, again, ensure that risks relating to the supplier aspects are identified, assessed, and controlled. And again, any risks that may affect the functionality of the product, the quality of the products being delivered, for example, would be for the senior supplier to ensure that they are being actively monitored. The project manager, fairly obvious, we've covered a lot of this in our previous discussions, but yes, they create the risk management approach in initiating a project process. They create and maintain the risk register across the processes, and of course will ensure that the project risks are identified, assessed, and controlled. Team managers participate in identification, assessment, and control of risks. Again, engaging with team managers to identify risks is a good way of doing it. Certainly, as when the work packages are being authorized, that consultative relationship that exists there between project managers and team managers is an opportunity for the team manager to participate. Project assurance now will review the risk management practices to ensure that they are performed. Project assurance will be responsible for reviewing lots of aspects of risk management, in particular the practices, the risk management practices, to make sure that they are performed in line with the approach. And project support, again, will assist the project manager in maintaining the project's risk register. And again, may be dedicated the task solely of looking after it rather than just assisting, particularly if the project is part of a program or part of quite a mature organization where there's some central PMO, project management office, or EPMO, enterprise project management office. And sometimes there, all risk registers for all projects are maintained by a single sort of specialist element of the PMO dedicated solely to risk and risk management. Okay, well, that about wraps it up then for us and the risk theme. Take the time now to review the manual, review this chapter in the manual, review the practitioner syllabus and ensure that all of the key points have been covered. And then don't forget to go and do the questions from sample paper 1 in the resource area that relate to risk. And once you've done that, you can watch the rationale videos. Those rationale videos are very important in that they provide guidance about the answers, as well as some information behind the thinking that goes into the questions. And there may well be some additional learning points to take from that. After you've done that, you can come back and join me in the next module.